Our final speaker for this afternoon session is Professor Gad Yair from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And he's going to make a sharp change from the previous talk, and he's going to discuss the big debate in German literary circle about resistance during the Third Reich.
Thank
He's
you.
one of the organizers. So I will vacate my space quickly.
Thank you. Just, I want to make sure that you hear me well. Okay. Toda, Eina, thank you. So two comments.
We hear you perfectly.
Okay. So two comments before I begin. One is a big thanks to Ron Meir, who in a span of less than 2 months taught us all how to organize a conference. And basically the meaning of what effectiveness in academia is. So Aaron, thank you. And the second comment is a response to someone presenting yesterday about emotions during the protest. And I am sitting now in Miami full of remorse and shame for not being with you right now. So I'm out of Israel for 5 days now. And it's a horrible experience to be outside of what's going on in Israel. So just acknowledging the guilt feelings. Okay, my paper. At the end of 1945, a dispute broke out between two groups of German authors, those who left Germany during the 1930s and went on to live in exile during the years of Nazi control, and those who decided to stay, live, and write in Nazi Germany. At the heart of the debate lay the question of inner emigration, which, by the way, was raised during the first weeks of the demonstrations in Kaplan. Both sides to the debate used the term to describe a state in which authors stayed in Germany, but allegedly emigrated inward, detaching themselves from the world around them. The groups were arguing about the ability to resist in Nazi Germany. Commentators later termed this argument die große Kontroverse, the big debate. I begin by describing the great controversy around the notion of inner emigration. I then move to the heart of the paper, examining the idea of inner emigration in two major publications by Hans Falada, In Main and Fremden Land, and Every Man Dies Alone, which was a bestseller in Israel, and later most of his writings were published in Hebrew, including the first book. I used those books to examine how Falada handled the basic issues of the dispute over inner emigration. The inner emigration controversy broke out after Thomas Mann, the world-renowned author, German author, addressed the German nation after its defeat on May 1945. Mann lived in exile during the war and delivered the address at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. Though he later felt bad for making the following negative statement, he said that, and I quote, "It may be superstitious belief, but in my eyes, any books which could be printed at all in Germany between 1933 and 1945 are worse than worthless and not objects one wishes to touch. A stench of blood and shame attaches to them. They should be all pulped." In response to Thomas Mann's critique, Walter von Molo, a distinguished author who stayed in Germany during the war, published an open letter to Thomas Mann. Von Molo recognized the immeasurable effect of Mann's perspective and actions, being Germany's greatest living writer, and believed that Mann could be part of those leading Germany into a path of healing. Consequently, von Molo appealed to Mann and asked him to return to his homeland. He asked Mann to view many of the Germans who stayed within the country's borders during the war as victims of the Third Reich rather than as collaborators with the Nazi regime. He attempted to convince Mann that the Germans faced little choice. Therefore, he said, they should not be held responsible for what had happened. 2 weeks later, another letter appeared. It was by Frank Thies, a novelist who, like von Lolo, remained in Germany and continued to write under the Nazi regime. Thies' reply took von Lolo's ideas a step further. Unlike his colleague's humbler attempt to defend the inner emigrants' actions, Thies claimed that the inner emigrants were the true resistors against the Nazi regime, and that they alone, and I quote, shared the fate honestly with their ordinary German brothers and sisters. Most importantly, Thies brought the notion of inner emigration into the debate, using it to portray those authors who remained in Germany but distanced themselves from the Nazi regime. In Thies' eyes, the idea of inwardness or self-emigration was so real that it created a distinct difference between two groups of authors who stayed in Germany: those who surrendered to the Nazi regime and its values, and those who emigrated inward. He went on to claim that he, von Lolo, and other authors could be set aside from the rest because the world on which we inner German emigrants supported ourselves was an interior space that Hitler was unable to conquer in spite of all his efforts. Put blatantly, Thies was claiming that inner emigration separated good people from bad in Nazi Germany. Though the bad Germans had taken over, the good Germans continued to exist even if in psychological hiding, veiling themselves far away from the influence of the Nazi devil. The good Germans, he argued, were able to retain their purity by splitting their psyche, obeying authority, yet retaining a free realm internally. The Great Debate brought to the fore the idea of inner emigration as a unique cultural strategy. The authors evoked it in an attempt to rid themselves of guilt feelings. Their strategy reflected a culturally constituted psychological and moral ability to split one's being into two halves. The Lutheran tradition, celebrated in the historical poem Die Gedanken sind frei, which the Nazis censored at the time, allowed Germans to feel free even when in shackles. The theological split syndrome underlay the subjective capacity of inner emigration. This is why German authors could argue that they psychologically left Germany and intellectually migrated from their homeland, yet do so while physically remaining at home. The cultural split syndrome allowed them to distance themselves from the reality of the Third Reich by maintaining inner intellectual freedom, yet they did so while conforming to the political and civic duties that the Nazi regime demanded. According to Stefan Brockman, the prominent interpreter of the Great Debate, and I quote, "The concept suggested that there were two types of intellectual emigrants from Nazi Germany: the outer or physical emigrants who had physically removed themselves from the geographical entity Germany, and the inner or spiritual emigrants who had removed themselves on the level of ideals and geist from morally repugnant Germany while remaining physically inside German borders." And I now move to analyze Hans Falada and his quarrels with the concept of inner emigration. Falada, just to make a note, was not part of the inner emigration debate, and he was never a spokesman for the inwardness movement. However, Falada's writings clearly speak to the broader discourse that stemmed from the German controversy over inwardness. Though he wrote before the Great Debate, and he died as it was being made, his writings openly correlate with the core arguments over inner emigration. In fact, Falada's liminal position allows a nuanced understanding of inner emigration that is absent from the heated exchange between the authors who were fully invested in the controversy. His writings reflect an immense personal struggle with the core concept of inner emigration and their implications. By expressing both sides of the argument, often simultaneously, Falada's writings bring forth the difficulties of authentically embodying the split. Throughout 1944, while imprisoned in an institute for insane criminals, Hans Falada secretly kept a diary written in code on paper he was given with the intention of writing novels in support of the Nazi regime. These diaries were recently decoded and published, revealing further aspects of this complicated and controversial author. Some have suggested that Falada's diaries should be understood as an attempt to defend his decision to stay and work in Nazi Germany, rather than to flee abroad like Thomas Mann. And it points to the strong connection between his line of defense and the wider concept of inner emigration. With these themes in mind, I examine two of Falada's major texts, his prison diary in Meinem Fremdenland and Every Man Dies Alone, which was later made into a movie. The former is a biographical account of Falada's life under the Nazi regime, the latter a fictional portrayal of resistance and everyday life in wartime Berlin. Reading them side by side conjures up the image of an authentic internal struggle between collaboration and inner freedom. This reading exposed Hans Falada's ambivalence about the theme of inner emigration. In contrast to the one-sided positions that the great controversy sharpened, Falada's references the ability to practice inner emigration as a mode of resistance against the Nazi regime and his indecisive position vis-a-vis the debate. Through the idea of inner spaces, Falada defends the life he and his colleagues led in Nazi Germany. Despite the never-ending difficulties they faced, Germans found internalized ways to stay true to their humanity, thereby fulfilling the moral dictum to obey while remaining free in spirit. Falada highlights and often exaggerates the effect that remaining in Germany had on the essence of Germanness, arguing that remaining in face of Nazi tyranny actually legitimized German society. As he phrased it, and I quote, "We have made each other courageous, and we became something because we stayed in Germany. We remained the salt of the earth, as some of us have not become dull and stupid." At the same time, Falada attacked the authors who left Germany and criticized their decision to leave. He also delegitimized the criticisms of the inner's action. In his eyes, those authors who left their country abandoned their role as Germans. These ideas are presented first in part of his personal dilemma, and I quote, "What kind of German would I be if I had gone away in those hours of distress to enjoy an easy life?" Later, he turned to harsher terms, prefiguring those of Thies a year later. Specifically, Falada directly attacks those who had left criticizing the right to discuss or censure the actions of those who stayed. By being away, he argued, exiled authors like Thomas Mann have no real inkling of the horrors of Nazi surveillance, making their critiques unrealistic and unfair. As he said, and I quote, "We have done nothing ridiculous like planning a conspiracy or revolution, as some expected us to do outside Germany, with a complete disregard of our period situation. After all, we were not suicidal, and our death would have served nothing." Overtly, Falada supports the fundamental ideas of inner emigration. His diaries propound the same ideas that von Lolo and Thies would express soon after. In reflexive moments, however, and like Thomas Mann, he comes to an opposite assessment, suggesting that inner emigration is hypocritical and amounts to nothing in practice. His complex and indecisive statements, which reflect his social position, undermine the one-sided nature of the great controversy. Falada's ambivalence is understandable as he stood in the midst of cross pressures. He remained in Germany, yet he was persecuted by the Nazis. Therefore, his testimony about the psychological capacity to create a split in one's self and engage in inner emigration is based on his own experiences. His diaries, a kind of postcard writing like in Gaul, like in prison, amount to the same resistance that his hero Otto Quangel engaged in. Falada regarded his own inward resistance through dreams and covert writings as the best he could do under the circumstances. However, from time to time, I find him adopting the contra perspective and mocking his own acts of resistance as futile and meaningless. Undoubtedly, Falada was struggling with inner emigration as a mode of legitimate resistance. On the one hand, he was embracing its inner qualities. On the other, he acknowledged the limitations that come with it. He advances Otto Quangel's actions as a true model of resistance, one that is not based on practical outcomes of actions, but rather on the defining moral process that he goes through. The resistance that Falada overtly supports occurs on an inner and personal level. Against that standard, any attempt to assess resistance by practical standards will ultimately fail. Yet Falada does not use this quality of inner emigration in the same way that its defender did. In Every Man Dies Alone, Falada was suggesting that the attempts by both sides of the controversy to reach an outer definition of an inner resistance and to defend oneself or attack another by using it is destined to fail. In some sense, the German split syndrome is a moral insurance policy. The moral qualms of Hans Falada suggest that by claiming that one lived through inner emigration and engaged in inward resistance, one guarantees a safe haven from external indictment. As Hannah Arendt suggested, German culture made this bifurcated mode of defense, arguing for only going through the motions while internally resisting them, into a banal practice. The split syndrome guarantees moral impunity. It is self-congratulating, and it dissolves external attacks. Because of that, the controversy about inner emigration, resistance, and German guilt will undoubtedly live on. And let me add a final relevant note. The mode of resistance I described here proved to be politically futile. However, German history provided lesser peaceful options, notably the attempts by Georg Elser and Colonel Stauffenberg to assassinate Hitler. While we should look for the latter as a model, the former, the inner emigration strategy, is not the practice that would halt the coming attempts to annul or derail Israeli democracy. I'm missing a model. I missed this. While we should not look for the letter as a model, okay, we're not going to assassinate anyone. But writing notes for thy neighbors, like the Krangels did, will not stop the current government. What will stop the current government? Only history will tell, and the protest movement. Thank you very much.